talking to book people about books and other stuff.
Hello, and welcome to Series 2 of Talking to Book People about books and other stuff, in which we're going to chat to lots more author friends, past and present, about what they've been up to during lockdown, but more especially this time, what they're looking forward to when lockdown ends or continues to slowly end, as we hope it's now beginning to do, and also what they've been reading, whether they've been writing, and maybe, of course, chatting about whatever their latest or forthcoming books might be. Now, the first person I'm going to speak to is Abir Mukherjee, whose brilliant series of detective novels set in India, beginning just after World War One, and which introduced us to the fantastic character Sam Wyndham. So the first one was A Rising Man. If you didn't check that out, then do consider it. It is such a great read and such a brilliant introduction to the series, which is now up to book 4, and A Death in the East. And that book is just about to come out in paperback, delayed as so much has been by this pandemic of ours. So let's give Abir a call. He's up in Scotland. That's where he spent his lockdown time, and let's see what he has to say to us. Well, thank you so much for spending a little bit of your lockdown time having a chat with us. It's interesting. I've been talking to lots of writers about how it's been affecting what they do. Are you in a writings phase at the moment? And has this sort of caught you in the middle of that, or were you researching? What stage are you at?
I was at the stage of panic stations.
Oh, okay.
Which tends to be my natural state, to be honest. It's either sheer laziness or panic. I'm going to miss a deadline.
Right.
When this all started, I was sort of working towards the end of producing book 5 of the Sam Wyndham series, and I was also planning out an idea for a standalone.
Oh, okay.
So those things had been sort of percolating in my head since about January. And then when this all hit in March, I think like most writers, or like many writers at least, I couldn't write in March. There was just too much happening in the world. And I think that part of your brain where these ideas percolate just got like swamped with, COVID and everything else. So I think March was a wee bit of a write-off. Perversely, April was really good. April was a fantastic month in terms of works written. I think once we decided what to do with the kids, in terms of once we had their routine sorted, I think my routine fell into place a lot.
And are they school age? I mean, did you have all that kind of?
They are. One is 5 and the other is 11, so they're the worst like possible age, and they're both gits. And I hate them. No, I love them. Yeah, but I think so. April was a good month in terms of writing. And then May went back a wee bit, but again, I was juggling the 2 projects.
So when you got into that early April phase, were you sort of more productive than you would usually be? Were you writing even more, or?
I was actually. I mean, I'm not particularly productive at the best of times, to be honest. So the bar's quite low.
Okay.
But I think I was more productive in April than I remember being. Other than, writing for a week before a deadline.
And I mean, I guess there was a little bit of less pressure on deadlines in the sense that there was a sort of understanding, and the publishers have been adjusting things left, right, and centre. I mean, did the paperback release of the 3rd book get delayed a little as well?
The 4th book, it's been delayed. It was supposed to come out in April, but they pushed that back to August.
Yeah.
And they've also said, because of that, we're going to push the launch of book 5 into probably early summer or Q2 anyway next year. So that's given me a couple more months. Yeah. So it's worked out. Okay.
But does that mean you also missed out on some publicity? Because I guess you would have been doing a bit of touring, would you, for the paperback, or was that mostly centered around the hardback for the Sam Wyndham series?
We were lucky in that we did a lot of touring for the hardback, more than I've done before, and so I missed that. I missed for me, one of the great things of being lucky enough to do this is just meeting people, going around the world and meeting people. I'd never have that opportunity otherwise. Yeah. So I do feel that loss quite a bit. Hopefully we'll be back to normal next year.
Well, yeah, and that's an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, do you think it'll change the way those events work? Maybe it's going to be difficult. It's a difficult question to ask, but I know that we're thinking about it. I know that publishers are thinking about it. Do you think there's going to be any long-term change
I
Do
can't
you see
say.
yourself doing more of this, or do you think we'll all sort of revert?
I would hope we would revert. I
Yeah.
think obviously it'll all be led by the science, and my fear is that a lot of the festivals, the demographic of people who go to these festivals are at higher risk. So
Yeah.
I think they should only come back once it's safe to do so. But I think if we didn't have festivals, we would be losing a lot culturally and emotionally. I think from a writer's point of view, I see this sort of festival season as a time to meet a lot of my friends, from around the world, readers and writers. And what we do is quite a solitary profession. I've developed what we call crime writer's arse from sitting on it for so long. And so, the getting out and about to these festivals is one way of combating that.
You think that? I wonder if that's even more of a thing for, for crime writing, particularly, or for,
Well, we are facts, you're right.
It's like a little bit of a tour scene, right? Yeah, well, not just the arse thing, but like just the sort of tour scene, because you must sort of come across one another a bit more. Because not only, sure, you might do events at a regular literature festival, but then there are plenty of tours and literature festivals, but geared specifically towards crime. So do you end up having this kind of solidarity? And have you already got to the point now, several books into the Sam Wyndham series, where you're seeing kind of super fans, or you've got fans that connect with you regularly?
To answer the first part, yeah, I think there's something about crime writers. It's probably the warmest and welcoming bunch of people that I've ever had the pleasure of working with. Megastars like Ian Rankin and Val McDermid and Lee Child not only sort of say hello to you, they go out of their way to help you.
Right.
And that's amazing. These are people who don't need to give me the time of day, but they have been, people like Val McDermid. Val McDermid's been such a supporter of my career that I've been extremely lucky. And the whole sort of mob of crime writers just tend to be wonderful people. And so it's tough not seeing them. Getting together and having a drink is one of the joys of being in this sort of industry. In terms of fans, there are fans that you see who turn up at quite a lot of events, and they become like friends. So, and they are friends. So it's great, and we do miss that. But these days with social media and Zoom calls, etc., you do stay in touch. Crime writers themselves are being quite proactive. There are, people organising festivals and things, and people inviting you on. So a lot of people are running their own sort of YouTube channels now, and so there is still that interaction. And I think we are, as you say, I think we're very lucky as crime writers to have this sort of close-knit community. You look at other genres, and I've heard stories about writers scratching each other's eyes out, and it's the romantic fiction authors you've got to watch.
Really?
Yeah. We're the nice ones. We get all our angst out on the page, all our sort of dark thoughts. So
there's a lot of dark looks between the sort of romance novelists side by side at a signing queue. If one queue gets a bit,
I can imagine, yeah.
Listen, for people who haven't yet come across them, can you just sort of introduce us or introduce me to Sam Wyndham?
Sure. So my books are set in the 1920s in colonial India. And Sam Wyndham is an ex-Scotland Yard detective. He's a survivor of the First World War who finds himself in Calcutta, basically because it's slightly preferable to suicide. He's not got many good options. And the least bad of them is this posting to Calcutta, where he joins the Imperial Police Force. And essentially, I am just looking at the history of that period of the British in India. And I'm trying to essentially tell the stories that we don't talk about. That is part of our joint history of the British and Indians. But we either tend to sweep it under the carpet or look at it through rose-tinted specs. And coming from both cultures, my parents came from India. I wanted to really look at the truth of that period because I wanted to find out about my own heritage, but also about British heritage that we've forgotten. And so I didn't want to write a history book because I wanted people to read it. So it came quite natural for, I'm sorry, that's harsh. And you know, I grew up in the west of Scotland, where we've always had this tradition of the crime novel as social commentary. And so when it came time to write my books, it felt natural to write them as crime novels. Because, you know, history is one thing, but you can't have a proper book without dead bodies along the way. For me, it was about wanting to scratch an itch. There was, you know, I was not, at school, we weren't taught about the British history of empire. And I would go to school and I would learn things. I would come home and my dad would say, that's very good, it's wrong. And half the time he was wrong and half the time school was wrong. But the fact is, there's a whole other narrative that we are not aware of. And I think if we don't know our history, as people say, you're destined to repeat your failures. And I mean, I look at things like the Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, where we went to war, I think with good intentions. But if we'd known our history, we'd know that we British like to believe we're always on the side of the angels. But our history shows that we are very often not on the side of the angels. And when you grow up between two cultures, you have that natural cynicism, which I think, you know, people who come from one culture maybe develop later on in life, or maybe don't develop at all. And so for me, it was really a question of wanting to highlight these issues in history and shout about them, to be honest. The story I really want to tell, and the one that sort of fired the anger within me, is the Bengal Famine of 1942 to 43, and not many people know about that, which is you know, at the height of the war, when you know, 3 million to 4 million Jews were being gassed in Europe, 3 million Bengalis, Indians, were starved to death in a man-made famine, at which a lot of the blame lies at Churchill's door. And you know, my father would tell me stories of seeing skeletons just walking into the streets of Calcutta and dying, you know, bodies just dying in the streets. And yet we don't hear about it. We don't know about it. You can Google it, it's all there. And it's part of our history, and it's a stain on our history. But we don't mention it. And at the same time, the man who is probably most responsible for it is our greatest ever, you know, Englishman, shall we say, because he's not particularly popular in the west of Scotland, to be honest, because he sent tanks into Glasgow as well. But you know, it's these sorts of things. You know, we talk about immigration and integration, but we should know our own history. And for me, writing these books was about examining that history, but not from the point of view of somebody who's going to criticize everything, because that's not my intention. My intention is to try and get to the truth. And I think that's easier for me sitting between both cultures than it is for somebody who is completely Indian or white British. And to be honest with you, I've been overwhelmed by just how the emails and the letters that I get from people saying, thank you for highlighting this, thank you for telling us about this. And it's wonderful, it's great. I mean, my father's passed away now, but he knew the first book was coming out. He did say to me, do you think people are ready to read things like this? And it turns out they were.
I mean, do you think that's also a sort of testament to how fiction, and especially crime fiction, maybe it's a great vehicle, isn't it, for getting people to address some very serious subjects, you know, because it is true that more people are likely to pick it up and more people's eyes are going to be opened that way. And maybe even, you know, that's not what they first reach for the book. You know, maybe some of them, people who pick it up, I mean, I guess we see it all the time. You're going to sell your book to people who are interested in history, historical fiction, crime fiction, you know, people who just want to escape to a different place and time. But I guess you're going to find lots of people are going to stumble across these episodes of history that you're highlighting, not necessarily knowing that's what's coming.
Well, I think you're right. And first and foremost, and it was actually advice given to me by Val McDermid, which was, first and foremost, you have to write a cracking story. The history and the message you can put in there, but first and foremost, you have to entertain people. That's what you're doing. and so the balance between message and story and plot, I think plot and story come first. It's about weaving your message in as subtly as possible, because you don't want to preach to people either, because that just turns people off, especially when you're dealing with difficult subjects. So really, when I write, it's about the relationship between Sam and Surrender Not and some of the other characters, the plot, and then the background is really the history.
Yeah. And what about thinking of the plot element? I think you described sort of the Death in the East as a kind of almost a homage to Agatha Christie in the style. You were going back to. I mean, is that one of your big crime influences? Anyway, is it that golden age? But it sort of the beginning point is a sort of locked room idea, right?
Absolutely. I think, we owe so much to Agatha Christie, and I think, the vast majority of crime authors and crime readers have an affection for Agatha Christie. She was the first to do so many things. And so many of my, not just her, but so many of my favorite authors have had a go at the locked room mystery, where you have a body found in a room, murdered, doors and windows are locked, how is it done? And so I wanted, and I think a lot of authors, crime authors, want to do their own take on the locked room mystery. It just took me 5 years to come up with an idea that hadn't been done before, as far as I could tell. And so when it came to writing it, that's what I started with. I had this idea for, I can kill a body in a room and nobody will know how it's done. And so I started writing this, and this is the 4th book in the series, and it sees Sam, who's got a wee bit of an opium problem, decide to seek rehab in an ashram in near the foothills of the Himalayas. And he's on the way to this ashram. He sees a ghost from his past in London 20 years earlier. And that triggers another narrative, which is we see Sam on his first case as a young constable in London. And the reason that happened is I didn't start out to set half of the book in London. That was a reaction to what was going on when I was writing this book. That was just after the Brexit vote. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of, fear of immigration, about integration and what it means to be British. And I felt I had to write something on that, because this sort of fear and this anger has always been there, but it's always been balanced by this openness, this fairness, this willingness to give people a chance. Yeah. I'm not saying there's not been racism. There's huge racism in the UK, but it is a fair country in many respects, and I feel we should all be privileged for the fact that we live here. And so it struck me, at this point I was living in East London, and it struck me that the streets that are now, majority lived in by Bangladeshi immigrants from, Muslim immigrants from Bangladesh, 100 years ago were populated by Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who were fleeing pogroms and persecutions. And they were doing the same jobs. And the press reacted in exactly the same way. You can take an article from 1905 and change the word Jew to Muslim and run it in some of our tabloid papers today. And to me, that was quite fascinating. On the one hand, you could think, well, nothing changes, and that's quite depressing. But I think you can also look at the positive, which is 100 years on, barring the aberration of, let's just say, some people in the Labour Party over the last couple of years. The fact is, the Jews are British, and they are a British integration success story in the way that so many other communities have been and are being. And I see no difference between that and the Muslim immigrants that are coming in the 70s and 80s. Yeah. Integration takes time, but this is a very open and welcoming country when it's at its best. Yeah. And I think we need to celebrate that. We need to remember who we are. Yeah. My father came to the UK in the 60s. He suffered great racism, but this country gave him opportunities that he didn't have in his own country. Yeah. And he was very, very thankful for that. Fact is, I grew up in a middle-class household. As the child of Indian immigrants, I had far better life opportunities than the white working-class kids who grew up 10 miles down the road in the Gorbals. Yeah. And that says something about British society. How much of what we see as issues of race and religion are actually issues of class and opportunity. And I wanted to sort of highlight those in the books, because too often we pick at we point to the easy target. It's, you know, the one who looks different from us, or, you know, it's a different religion, when really the problems that we face are those of opportunities for our working classes, and issues around gender. I think my personal view is that race comes after any of those.
How do you feel about what's going on in the US, and does that, and when you see that each time something like that blows up, does that also trigger something in your writer's mind and make you think if there's something, another element of today? Because there's so much going on today. It must be tempting to bring it all into your writing, but...
Well, that's partly why I'm writing a standalone. The standalone that I am going to write next is a modern day thriller set here and in America. And you know, it's looking at the issues around radicalization. But when we talk about racism and the fears around that, every time something like this happens, it reminds me of the fact that all gains need to be defended. We can't take anything for granted. No. And the veneer is really, really thin. You know, the progress that we've had can be lost at any time. I remember my mother telling me back in the late 70s, early 80s that, and you know, this is after Uganda and everything, where Asians were kicked out of Uganda. She would say, you know, there could come a day when we are thrown out of this country. And I've always laughed at that. And then there was the Windrush scandal. And you think, you know what? You know, my mother was right. The fact is that things that we take for granted, we always took for granted. Our Europeanness, our openness, our tolerance, all of these seem to be questioned every 20, 30 years. You know, whether it's Oswald Mosley and the fascists in the 30s, whether it's Enoch Powell in the 70s, whether it's the current things we're going through. At every stage, though, the British people, the majority of British people, have stood up for what is right and decent. And I think we can't take that for granted. I think we need to defend those values. And as a writer, my job isn't to hit people over the head with these things. It's to show them their better natures anyway. I'm always an optimist. People said to me, other writers said, why aren't you more angry? And I say, well, partly I'm old, so, you know, I can't be angry about everything all the time. But I think anger has its place. But, you know, at the same time, you need to co-opt people. You can't be angry and convince people all the time. It's difficult to convince people when you are angry and breaking things. It's easier to convince people when you show them their own better natures. And that's quite a Gandhian philosophy. And that, again, has come from my research. You know, that to me is fascinating. If you go at the heart of our democracy, you go to Parliament Square, opposite a statue of Churchill, you have a statue of Gandhi, the man who kicked the British out of India. There's nowhere else in the world where you will find something akin to that. You go to Paris, you won't find a statue to, you know, Ho Chi Minh or Ben Bella. You won't. No. It doesn't happen. There's something special in that relationship between the British and Indians, but also something that Gandhi did, which appealed to the psyche and the moral compass of the people he was fighting against. And I think, especially at times like this, it's an important message to remember.
What about reading? Have you done much reading during lockdown?
I have. I've done quite a bit of eclectic reading. I don't know whether this is conscious or subconscious, but I've read quite a bit of stuff which has made me feel good. Okay. So I've read Leonard and Hungry Paul. It's about two friends who are just little quiet men who essentially go about fixing the world through playing board games. And I loved that. The another book that I read in the last couple of months is Diary of a Somebody by Ryan Bilston.
Right, yeah. I haven't read it, but yeah, I know we have.
And that's very funny as well. It's about a poet called Brian, and his attempts to win the love of a lady called Liz at the poetry club. There's Steph Cha's Your House Will Fall. Okay. You've come across it. That is a crime book. She's an American writer of Korean origin.
Oh, really?
And this book is set in the current day, but it deals with the ramifications of the LA riots of the 80s upon a black family and a Korean family. It's a viewpoint that you won't get anywhere else. And this is one of the great things about what I think is happening in crime fiction and fiction in general now. You know, people say to me, well, what do you do differently that a white writer doesn't do or can't do? And I say, well, we write stories, but my camera angle is slightly different. I will give you a perspective that you will not necessarily get, or you will find it much harder to get from somebody who comes from a different background. And that in itself helps to broaden perspectives. If reading broadens the mind, then I would say you look at books written by people outside of what is the traditional mainstream, and that will broaden your horizons.
Do you think that the publishing world is getting better for that? And do you think there's more out there, more perspectives?
The optimist in me wants to say yes. The fact is that when I was first published 5 years ago, there were very few British Asian authors being published. Now in crime fiction, I think every year or so we're getting new British Asian authors and ethnic minority authors. So there's people like A.A. Dand, Amer Anwar. There's so many people coming through each year. Kia Abdullah, the latest one, I think her book, her new book is phenomenal. Really? I think it's called Take It Back. There are people coming through every year that it feels like there is a different mentality. At the same time, there's always the fear, and I'm feeling it right now, of people with the best of intentions jumping on the bandwagon. So in the last few days, all these publishers have been saying, well, we are open to submissions by BAME authors. We want to produce, and the people are going, well, where were you last week or the month before? Publishing is an odd industry. It seems to be people have the best of intentions, but things change extremely slowly, and I don't understand why.
I do also have a fear that we see it, not even taking it out of that context completely. You know, when colouring books were big, like there was like one colouring book, then another month there were like 50 that we could buy into the shop, and then like fast forward a year, and because of how slow it is just to simply produce a book, there are hundreds of colouring books that we could choose to buy in for our customers. Long since the customers had long since stopped doing colouring books. So you do get these worrying trends which are too sort of, you know, where everyone's jumping on the bandwagon, and then we're sort of too slow to actually capitalize because of the mechanics of the trade. And I really hope that making sure that there are authors, BAME authors, making sure that there is a continual procession of translated fiction from around the world, etc., making sure that we get perspectives from every gender and every sexuality. I really hope that these are not seen in those light, and there will be an element of that. I hope that the actual public, what seems to be a bedrock of genuine public demand for all these different voices, wins out and keeps it going past that.
I really hope you're right. You know, too often in the past, what has been published has been a bit of a tick box exercise, or you know, elements of it. And at the same time, as you say, there are fads. You know, this is flavour of the month, or we need a BAME author on our list. You know, these are the two sort of things. Or perversely, people are told, "Oh, your writing's not ethnic enough." Which is a bit odd. See, what people don't realise is that, you know, ethnic minorities are 99% as boring as anybody else in this country. Our food is better. That's all. And yet, trying to get that message through to a publisher who's expecting, you know, angst about arranged marriages and this and that. And, you know, nobody wants to write about those things, because, you know, things like that don't really happen to a great degree in a lot of communities. When it does happen, I mean, the book I mentioned, Kia Abdullah's Take It Back, and that's a fascinating book. That looks at, you know, rape and macho culture in certain Asian communities. And I know she's come in for a lot of flack for writing it, but that's exactly the sort of thing people should be writing.
Listen, one last question, and I'm going to let you go. What is the what's the one thing you're really looking forward to once you can actually move around normally? What's the big thing for you?
Well, I'll give you two, right? So firstly, I'm looking forward to just going down our local pub, which is the Drummond. In terms of something more interesting, I'd love to be able to go to America later this year. I was planning to go in April, I was up for an award, which I didn't win,
Right.
but I was going to sort of tack on a research trip.
Yeah.
Research trip, I love it. On the
Is
back
that
of it.
for the standalone?
Yes, for the standalone, I was going to research. A lot of it, about 90% of it's set in America. But I'll tell you a funny story before I go. So I have a friend who's a writer, and she's a Muslim, but she's quite a practicing Muslim. She used to wear the hijab. She doesn't anymore. She did a road trip around the southern states of America.
Really?
And she was amazed at how friendly her reception was. And that, I think, is a very positive message.
Yeah.
And I'm all about the positive. So it's reassuring, and it's good that to still believe in human nature and human goodness. If we have that as our starting point, that's where you build from. Yeah. Again, we're back to Gandhi. My goodness, we've done it. Dead bodies to Gandhi. Wow. And back again.
Back again. Awesome. Listen, thank you so much, and looking forward to I hope to see you around here one time. And until then, look forward to seeing the paperback come out, and then book 5 in due course.
Cheers. Thank you so much, Nick.
Thanks a lot, Abir. Cheers. Bye bye now.
Please note, no book people were harmed in the making of this film, though some were technologically challenged. All books are available from www.mrbeesemporium.com.